And I want to welcome everyone. So thank you for being here tonight for the second of our 3 sessions with Rabbi Danny Nevins. The bio that you have here is quite long. I didn't think it made sense to read the whole thing, especially because it's the second time that we are all together. So hopefully people heard it the first time. I'll say that I'm especially appreciative of being able to be part of this whole experience with Rabbi Nevins. As those of you who are on the call by now probably have gathered, he was the dean at the time that I was in rabbinical school. We learned together, we had a great time together. I actually attended a few of the Shabbaton camping trips that he had led for hiking and up in the Adirondacks. So I was very fortunate to be able to be a recipient of his love of the mountains, which I also share. We buy our own food and cook at the house of a friend of his. And I'm hopeful that you still did that after I left. I'm sure you did. And you'll find other ways to enjoy the mountains, even if you're not taking rabbinical students up there on a yearly basis, now that Rabbi Nevins is taking over as, I don't know what the official title is. Is it the new head of school?
Yeah, head of school.
Great. At the Golda Academy, which is actually the school that I attended when I was in high school, except it wasn't yet called Golda Academy. It was the Solomon Schechter School of Essex and Union in West Orange, New Jersey. So our lives have woven together and intersected at many points, and it's lovely to have Rabbi Nevins with us here in Jacksonville for these 3 sessions. So for those of you who are here for the first time and you were not with us on Thursday, in for a treat. And for those who are here for a second time around, you know what it's like to learn with Rabbi Nevins, but I'm sure every time he teaches, it's a little different. So I'm glad that you've joined us for this second of our 3 sessions. The topic tonight, I didn't catch the exact title, but do you have it to share with us?
I think it's on human dignity in Jewish law.
Yes, I just wasn't sure if there was something specific. So that is what we'll be talking about.
We'll get specific.
That's the topic. Great. And without further ado, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Rosenblum. It's so wonderful to see you and to remember you when you were a student, and such a great student, and also a professional archer. I always think about you with that, and shooting arrows with you up in Ramon in Colorado, as well as, so we've been in a few different mountains together. So I wanted to talk today a little bit on a theological and historical level to start with, and then to zoom into a practical level, and then to talk about some applications in our time. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint for you tonight, so we can go into breakout groups, but I first am going to give you, I hate to say it, but a bit of a lecture. So I hope that's okay. I'm going to start by saying that you may know this fancy term. It's called anthropomorphic. Okay? Anthropomorphic means looking like a person, right? And when we say that something is an anthropomorphic image, it's an image that something that's not normally depicted in human terms is now being described in human terms, and specifically God, right? So if you think of God as an old man with a white beard sitting on a throne in the sky, that's an anthropomorphic image of God, right? Like a person. And in the ancient world, and even in the modern world, it's very common to think of the divine realm as basically being a human realm on steroids. The Greeks had their Mount Olympus, where the gods were up there, and they had relationships, parent-child relationships, husband-wife relationships, betrayals, friendships, loyalty, and so on between them. And they were basically like a big human family. It's called a pantheon. And so too with other religious systems in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, in Asia, in the Hindu pantheon and others. Basically, the divine realm took a human shape. And one of the features which we like to think is distinct about biblical religion, and then Judaism growing out of biblical religion, is that it's not anthropomorphic. We don't describe God in human terms. Now, it's true that the Bible has many descriptions of the hand of God, the mighty hand of God. God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, b'yad chazakah v'tzor netuya. But we modern Jews have been influenced by medieval Judaism, specifically by Maimonides, to say that when the Bible uses such language that describes a divine body part, or even a divine physical feature like the voice of God, Vayidaber Adonai al Moshe, where God spoke to Moses. Well, speech, like what I'm doing right now, uses vocal cords, right? And when you speak back, how do you hear someone? Well, we use our ears, right? So the implication that speaking with God and God speaking with us is that God has a larynx, for example. And Maimonides said, no. When the Bible says those things, it's using metaphorical language. It doesn't really mean it. God does not have a body. And as you know, when we sing Yigdal, which is a song that's based on Maimonides' philosophy, we say, in lo demut haguf ve'eno guf. God doesn't have an image of a body, and God isn't a body. Then that's basically referring to this sort of Greek idea, frankly, a philosophical idea, that anything with a body has limitations, and anything with limitations is temporary, and anything which is temporary can't be eternal by definition. Therefore, if we want to believe that God is eternal, then we have to believe that God is beyond time and beyond space. Beli Reshit, Beli Tachlit, as we say in Adon Olam. No beginning, no end, right? And so we have this idea of an eternal God who doesn't have a body, right? So if you were to ask me what is like the core idea of Judaism, it would probably be that God is eternal and God is not limited in any way. And I would like to say that that's how we consistently act and believe. But the truth is actually a little bit more complicated than that. First of all, the truth, even for those ancient Near Eastern religions, right, and the Greek religions, may also have been a little more complicated. They may have believed that the different divinities that they had in their pantheon had sort of a perfect form, which then sort of took shape periodically in a human form and then went back to being in its perfect form, right? And in fact, Christianity is in some ways a hybrid of biblical religion, of a sort of a creator God without shape, and then of Greek religion and Greco-Roman religion, of gods that sort of are born, they walk around the earth, they have adventures, they suffer, they have joy, they love, they hate, all those things, and then they go back to where they came from, and the world sort of remembers their adventures with these gods that walked on earth. But Judaism, like Islam, right, has an idea that God is a unified being and that God is an eternal being, and therefore God can't have a body. Right? So that is, I think, the ideal idea that many of you grew up with and continue to believe. The problem is that it's not always so clear. For example, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and they hear the call. Vayishma'u et kol Adonai Elokim mithalech bagan l'ruach hayom. They hear the voice of God's footsteps, God walking around, galumphing around the garden in the windy time of the day, presumably in the afternoon. They hear God walking. You could say, okay, but that's also a metaphor. Well, God speaks to Moses, panim o panim, face to face, like a person speaks with their friend. Gosh, that sort of sounds a bit like they're speaking in a human type of form. In fact, there are several places where we're told, lo yirani adam v'chai, a person can't see me and live. That implies that God, in theory, could be seen, but it would be so overwhelming that a person would die. In fact, right after the theophany at Mount Sinai, the people of Israel say to Moses, Daber ata imanu v'lo namut. You speak with us so we don't die. Don't make us talk to God again. And there are midrashim that they actually died when they spoke with God directly. It was so overwhelming. But that would imply that God does have a body. It's just so glorious that a person can't see it and survive the encounter. Now, we also have a couple of prophetic works, specifically the book of Ezekiel. Maybe you were in shul the first day of Shavuot when the Haftarah was read. And it says, Umimala Rakia, above the heaven, Asher al Rosham, which is over the heads of these angelic creatures that Ezekiel has noticed. Evan Sapir, Demut Kiseh. It looks like there's a sapphire, right, stone in the shape of a chair. So it's a throne made out of sapphire, this beautiful blue throne. The Al Demut HaKiseh, and on the image of the chair, Demut, there's an image, Kimar Adam, that looked like a man, Alav Milamala, on it above. So it's careful language to be sure, but it does seem to sound like Ezekiel, at least in his vision, sees God like a person, like a man specifically, although Adam, I guess, could be androgynous, right? But he sees a human figure up on the throne. Now, you might say, well, but that's just a vision, and so that too can be a metaphor. Perhaps so. The prophet Daniel, and by the way, my name is Daniel Nevins, but you don't know that my Hebrew name, Daniel, is also Daniel Yechezkel. So Daniel Ezekiel. So I've got these two prophets in my name, and they both have these visions of God. In Daniel chapter 7, which you did not read on Shavuot, there's a description that there was a great throne made, and it says, Va'atik Yamin Yatev, and the Ancient One of Days sat on the throne. And what does God look like? What does this Ancient One of Days look like? Levushe Kitlad Chivar. His clothing looked like white snow. Usa'ar Reshe Ka'amar Neke. And the hair on his head looked like sort of combed wool. Like when you get wool from a sheep, it's usually got all sorts of junk stuck in it. But in this case, it was combed. Karsei Shrivin Dinur Galgole Nur Dalik. And so everything is actually surrounded by fire. So Ezekiel and Daniel both have an image of God as being like an old man with white hair, right? Now, we often like to make fun. I'm sure Rabbi Rosenblum somebody has said, Rabbi Rosenblum, I don't believe in God. And she's learned to say, well, tell me what God you don't believe in, because if you're going to tell me it's the old man in the sky, right, I don't believe in that God either. Right? It's a very clever way out of that, and so that we can get into a conversation about how do you imagine God. But the truth is that at least these two texts do seem to imply that God, at least to these prophets, took on a shape that's familiar as an old man. And so you've got these biblical texts which are anthropomorphic. But still, you could say, and I think you'd be right if you did, that how many books of the Bible are there? There's 24 books of the Bible. How many chapters? There's hundreds and hundreds of chapters. There's thousands and thousands of verses. You've just cherry-picked and come up with 4 or 5 verses in the entire Hebrew Bible, right, that describe God as having an embodied form, and those could easily be explained as anthropomorphic, and I think that, as metaphorical, and I think that's true. In contrast to Greek mythology or Hindu mythology or Mesopotamian mythology, we do not have much of a description of God, of God's height, of God's shape, God's appearance in any other places. So therefore, we can go back to my initial statement that we Jews do not have an anthropomorphic idea of God. Did I lose you yet? You still with me? Still with me? Okay. I'm looking at how many squares here? We've got looks like 16 of us or so, right? And I'm only seeing actually live video of a few of you, but could you imagine if I said to you that there are actually 8 images of God in front of my face? Hi, Kim. Right? I'm actually looking at God right now, right? Not Kim's avatar, but when Kim actually videoed on, that I'm looking at God. So how do we get that idea that we are looking at God when we look at each other? Well, that's because it says also in Genesis that when God created humanity, it says, Vayivra Elohim et Adam, when God made Adam, humanity, B'tsalmo, in his image, B'tselem Elohim barauto, in the image of God he made him, Zachar and Nekeva barautam, male and female, he created them. And here we get this idea of an original androgynous image of God. Now, the idea here then is that human beings are kind of like statues of God, walking statues. In the ancient Near East, you would go to a temple, or in the Greco-Roman world, you would go to a temple, you'd see a statue of Zeus, you'd see a statue of Baal, you'd see a statue of Ramses, whatever. Ramses is a king, of course, but you'd see a statue of one of the divine figures, and you would think, this statue is not just a statue, it actually inhabits, or the God inhabits its statue. In fact, one of our professors, Ben Sommer, wrote a book called The Bodies of God in the Ancient Near East, and he described what's called a pit peh ceremony, where they would take the statue, they would rub oil on its lips, and they would anoint it with oil on its head, and at the end of that ceremony, they would say that the God would enter his statue. So we have this idea that when God breathes the breath of life into Adam, Adam becomes a nefesh chaya, a living, breathing creature, and Adam becomes a walking statue of God. Now, there are implications to this. Let me give you two of them. The first implication is that if we are all statues of God, we are all images of God, then you could say God doesn't want too many statues, but that's not what it says. Right there in Genesis, it says, right after describing humanity being in the image of God, what does it say? The first commandment, anyone know? Peru uravu, be fruitful and multiply. It's as if God is like a franchise company, and it's good to have 50 McDonald's, but it's better to have 5 million McDonald's. There are a lot of people out there to eat burgers, right? God seems to feel that the more images of God there are in the world, the better. And what would be the opposite? If that's a positive commandment, to be fruitful and multiply as a way of increasing the image of God in the world, what would be the opposite of that? Murder, right? Murder is a crime against God. In the United States, if a person, God forbid, is murdered, it becomes a crime against the state, because the person, the murderer, as it were, is not only attacking their victim, but they're attacking the safety of the public and the credibility of the state, which is supposed to have a monopoly on violence. It's supposed to be the only one that's allowed to do violence. The rest of us have to follow the law. I know that's sort of a strange way of thinking about it, but if you think about it, the state can make war. The state can use the police to arrest people. The state can punish people with imprisonment. So the state does have power to control our bodies, right? We Americans would like to limit that, but individuals shouldn't kill one another, because when you do that, in religious terms, you are destroying the image of God, right? So it says in that verse, I'm sorry, let me pull that verse up. It says in the portion known as Noach, with the flood story, in chapter 9, it says, Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. If somebody spills the blood of a person, by a person their blood should be spilled. In other words, the punishment for murder is capital punishment. We murder a murderer, as it were. Why? Ki b'tselem Elokim asad adam, because God made humans in God's image. And it continues, and you shall be fruitful and multiply. Right? So what you've got here then is the idea that if humans are made in the divine image, then the positive thing we should do is protect that image and increase it. And the negative thing is we should protect that image and not destroy it through murder. And it is only an image, and it is temporary, and we do dry up like the grass of the field and the flowers and all that. But nevertheless, we are the image of God. So in the biblical world, this is a purely theological concept. Like I said, it has practical application to command procreation and to prohibit murder. But beyond that, it's just a biblical idea. But I want to tell you one crazy midrash. You know, there's a description in the Bible about capital punishment where a person is put to death by, I don't know exactly, it's called talui in Hebrew, being hanged, but it's not clearly a noose the way people are hanged in America. It could be it was an impalement type of thing. It could be it was a crucifixion type of thing. We don't know exactly. But the Bible says it's forbidden to hang somebody overnight. You can't leave their body overnight. Once they're dead, they have to be taken down. Why? It says because it's an abomination to God to leave the body overnight. That's all the Bible says. The rabbis come up with a midrash. They say, imagine a kingdom where there's a king who has a twin brother, and their twin brother is a villain. The king has a twin brother who's a villain and does a terrible crime and is sentenced to death. And he's hanged, and he's up there on the gallows. Okay? And all the people are looking at this criminal, and they say, look, the king is dead. And it's not the king, it's his twin brother. And the allegory is, so to God, says when a human body is desecrated, it's like the divine body is desecrated. And therefore, it is so abhorrent that God's own dignity is destroyed. Now, that word dignity, does anybody have the Hebrew word for dignity? Does anybody know what that is? You can unmute and just yell it out if you know it. I bet someone knows it. All right. Well, Rabbi Rosenblum, what's the word for dignity?
You're talking about the one we've been talking about earlier? Kavod habriot?
Yeah, so kavod habriot. So the dignity of people, right, or literally of creatures. The word kavod is a strange word in that when referring to God, we translated it as the glory. Baruch kavod Adonai mimkamo. Blessed is the divine glory from its place, right? So that's okay, Kim. So kavod for God is glory. Kavod for humans is dignity. But it's the same word in Hebrew. And in fact, as I've shown you, it actually is linked. Human dignity is derivative. It comes from the fact that we look like God. Right? And because we look like God, right, if something terrible is done to us, it diminishes not only us, but also God. Right? And so we've got this idea in Judaism that a way that we serve God is by serving other people. We dignify other people, and therefore we glorify God. Does that make sense to you? Anybody? People are very quiet. Obviously, you're all muted. That's very nice. But this is the theological background for a moral principle, which then becomes the legal principle. Right? So just to review, Judaism is overall not anthropomorphic. We don't like to think of God in human terms. A couple of strange verses notwithstanding, our image of God is mostly like our image of love or of justice or of compassion, sort of qualities in the world which are not embodied. And yet, we do have some images of God in the Bible, and the most persistent one is the idea that we ourselves are in the divine image. We are not necessarily gods, but we are reflections of divinity in the world. Now, since even this small sample of humans in front of me looks different, right? Sandra and Lois and Carl and Ruchel and Wendy's in the dark, but everyone looks different. So do you say that God has infinite appearances? Maybe. Or you could say that the divine image is not our face and our physicality, but it's something within us. That spirit, like when you see somebody who's alive, okay, and you feel like I'm in the presence of a live creature, That's the divinity. One of the mitzvot that I do, which I don't enjoy, to be honest, is tahara, is washing the bodies of people who have died. And I'll tell you, it's very different being in the presence of a dead body from the presence of a live body, as many of you have experienced. There's some spark there that's just gone, right? And the body becomes an object. It's no longer, it's a special object that we have an obligation to care for, but it's no longer alive. And so it could be that the divine image is our being alive, our vitality. Or perhaps it's a moral quality, the sense that we have of right and wrong. Maybe that's the divine image within us. So I told you that this theological concept has moral applications. There is a teacher in the Talmud named Rabbi Akiva. I'm sure you've heard of Rabbi Akiva. And he has a statement that we find in Mishnah Pirkei Avot. You've heard of Pirkei Avot, I bet also. It's the sayings of the teachers, of the fathers, even chapter 3:14. It says, Hu haya omer, chaviv adam shenivra b'tzelem. Right? Beloved is humanity because we're made in the divine image. Right? And then his friend Rabbi Eliezer said, Yihi kavod chavercha chaviv alecha keshelach. Your friends or your neighbor's glory or dignity should be precious to you like your own. And think about it now. Right? If you see somebody diminished, if you see somebody despised, right, I think there's a natural instinct of self-preservation. I'm not going to get involved. I just walked home from our ordination ceremony, and I walked past Riverside Church, which Rabbi Rosenblum knows well. And, there's a whole row of people who put out their bedding for the night on the side of the church. And when I make eye contact with people who are unhoused or homeless, I try to smile and acknowledge their humanity and stuff, but I also don't want to get too involved. I do volunteer in a homeless shelter. I do contribute money to food pantries and that kind of thing, but I'm always a little bit worried about getting too involved with them because I know that I can't solve their problems. And yet, it seems that the obligation goes a little beyond that. It's not just to provide for their material needs, but it's also to see them as a tzelem, as an image of God. So, with that, we turn to some practical applications. The biblical period, it's a theological concept. The Tannaitic period, the early rabbinic period, it's also theological and a moral concept. Treat people with respect. I think we all like that idea, right? You all agree with that? Treat people with respect because they're made in the divine image. So now we get to the question of, is it just like a general value, or is it something that has practical implications? For example, the Declaration of Independence says that we believe that all people have the right to pursue happiness. Right? And I do. I think guys, go have a good time, man. Everyone do what makes them happy in life. But if someone said to me, Carl, I'm going to pick on you just because you're right in the middle of the screen. Carl says to me, the thing I really want is a Ferrari, and I want to be able to, do you? Yeah. Do you have a Ferrari? Okay. Carl wants a Ferrari.
Why not? Always aim high.
Exactly. He wants to be able to drive around the track at 200 miles an hour. Wouldn't that be amazing? The thing is that maybe Carl's budget doesn't support a Ferrari. You don't have a Ferrari budget right now. Now, is that true, Carl? You would like the Ferrari at least?
It's great theory. Not going to happen.
Right, not going to happen. But imagine if I said, well, actually, the Declaration of Independence says that you have an inalienable right to pursue happiness. And if you're sure that what would make you happy is the Ferrari, then I guess the rest of us are going to have to take up a collection and get you your Ferrari because, you have a right to pursue happiness. So you could interpret that part of American, it's not really law, but the Declaration of Independence to say that I guess if everyone needs to be allowed to pursue their happiness, then that imposes some obligations. Maybe taxpayers should give everybody their fantasy, and that's this one wants this thing, this one wants that thing, and the government is going to try to make everyone's dreams come true. Is that a realistic idea of government? Maybe in some place, but it's not so realistic. You could say that human dignity is like that. It's an aspirational goal. It's something that it would be, that all humans would be equal, all humans would be dignified, everybody would be happy. It could be. But what's interesting is that in the Talmudic era, a group of rabbis started to turn what was sort of a core belief, but not a practice, into a practice. And they started to say something interesting. Judaism is a bossy religion. Would you all agree with that? It's got a lot of ideas of things we're supposed to do. Yeah, okay, you can admit it. It's a bit bossy. It's telling us all sorts of things that are obligations. And if let's say, I believe that God tells me not to eat pork. Okay, I do indeed believe that. And if I go out to breakfast and they say, would you like bacon with your eggs? And I think, truth is I would like the bacon. And so please, yes, bring me the bacon and I eat it. If I do that with the awareness that the Torah says I shouldn't, and therefore that God says that I shouldn't, then in a way I've chosen in a very intentional way, right, my own desire, my own sense of need over the divine mandate. Right? Now perhaps there's an exonerating factor, perhaps I was really hungry, perhaps I forgot, there's all sorts of things. Perhaps I didn't grow up keeping kosher, I didn't really know about this stuff, I got into the habit, whatever. We can make lots of excuses, but the rabbis believed that at the moment that a person chooses their own desire over the divine mandate, they have reduced God's stature. It's what we call Chilul Hashem. We've made God ordinary. We've made God like just another person, just another Joe who says, got some powerful Joes now, but just another Joe who's told us what to do. And we said, no, I'm not doing it. You want me to be vaccinated? I'm not doing it. I am, by the way, vaccinated. I can show you my card. It's right here. Yeah. I happen to be sitting right by my card. Yeah. So, but you could say that to reject a divine command is to reduce God from being God to being like a nice suggestion, a tradition, a folkways, Mordecai Kaplan called it. Right? And that is to reduce divinity in the world. So the rabbi said, therefore, it is not permitted for a person to say, right, that I am choosing not to observe a divine command, with one exception, actually, which is to save their life. And you might ask, why do you get to save your life over a command to follow God's command? Wouldn't it be better to sacrifice your life in order to show how devoted you are to God's command? I'm asking you guys a real question. I want one of you to answer. Why is it, based on what we've said tonight, that saving your life or saving another person's life should be allowed to override a divine command, like keeping the Sabbath or fasting? Yaakov, why?
Pikuach nefesh. It's against the soul. So you have to save your soul because we're in God's image.
Beautiful, Yaakov. Right. So the reason you can violate the Sabbath or Yom Kippur is because you're a protector, you're a guardian of a little bit of the divine soul that's in you. Right? So the reason you are allowed to, in fact, obligated to violate a rule in order to save a life is because by doing so, you increase the glory of God by having another walking statue of God in the world. So you see how the system kind of makes sense. Whereas if you just said, no, I want my bacon, I hear it's crunchy and salty and yummy, I want that, then you're not, in fact, increasing the divine image. You're saying, God, I don't care what you have to say. And that diminishes the divine image in the world, you see? But not everything in Judaism is a divine command. The rabbis, I told you, Judaism is a bossy religion. The rabbis added a lot of extra stuff. They said, make a fence around the Torah. So they started to say, well, there are some mitzvot which we call deoraita. They're biblical. And there are others that are more added on. We call them dirabanan. They come from the rabbis. It's a little bit like felonies and misdemeanors in American law. A misdemeanor you really can't do. If you have your dog unleashed in the park when there's a sign that says dogs must be leashed, right? A cop can come and write you a citation. You're probably not going to jail for it if the dog didn't hurt anyone, it just pooped somewhere, right? But you have to pay a fine, right? So it's a lower level thing. And I think we would all agree that there's a place for misdemeanors. It sort of helps keep a peaceful society. But we also think a person who had their dog off leash and it didn't hurt anybody, right, probably shouldn't be sent to jail for 20 years. Would you all agree with me on that one? Yeah. Whereas a person who did a violent crime against another person, which is a felony, right, probably shouldn't just get a $5 penalty or even a $100 penalty, right? They've actually committed an offense against another person that's left them injured or worse, right? They should pay a larger fine. Right? So the rabbis had a similar system of what they called deoraita, biblical laws, and dirabanan. And they said, 20S is harsh, thanks, Kim. So the rabbis said that human dignity is so great that it overrides a negative command of the Torah. But then they have to clarify themselves. Which command of the Torah? And they said, a command that was made by the rabbis. You see, there's a verse in the Bible in Deuteronomy that says, everything the rabbis tell you, don't turn to the right or the left. Do what the rabbi tells you. So whatever Rabbi Rosenblum, right, says to you, right, or Rabbi Lubliner says to you, I'm sure you all do exactly what the rabbis indicate. I've heard that about Jacksonville Jewish Center, right? So the rabbis, in fact, felt that they had the authority to add commands to protect the Torah. But then they asked themselves a question. They said, let's say there's something that we feel strongly about, but we don't claim that it's actually a biblical law. And let's say somebody comes, right? Lois comes and says, Rabbi, I've got a dilemma. This thing that you want me to do, and I respect you, Rabbi, but it's causing a real problem for me. Whatever it is, it's causing me to do something which is undignified. Right? I hope you won't take it personally, Rabbi, but I'm going to have to do that, whatever that is. Right? And the rabbis could have insisted on their own authority, but they didn't. They said, if it's just a matter of our authority, we're going to say human dignity is higher than our authority. I'll give you an example. This is kind of gross, okay? Sorry. But they didn't have tissue paper back then, right? In this epidemic, a lot of us didn't have enough tissue paper either, right? Okay. So I don't know what you did, but back then what they did was they looked for rocks that were kind of smooth, right? And they kept a pile of, I went out to the supermarket yesterday and got Cottonelle, I think, right? They didn't have Cottonelle brand back then, they had rocks. Smooth rocks, but rocks. And so they would keep a little supply of them, and when they had to do their business, they would go to a sort of secluded place, and when they were done, they would sort of wipe with a rock and leave the rock, I guess, out in the field. And so be glad that you live in the 21st century. If you weren't already, this is a good improvement. I think we'd all agree toilet paper and indoor plumbing are among the nice parts of being modern humans. So the thing was this, though, you're not allowed to carry on the Sabbath. So what happens if where you are, you don't have a rock, and the only rocks you can find, you'd have to carry them for a while in order to get to a secreted place, a private place where you could do your business. Right? Can you, in fact, carry rocks on the Sabbath in order to use them for this purpose? And the rabbi said, well, maybe not in a biblically prohibited place, which is like a big public thoroughfare like Times Square. You're really not allowed to carry across Times Square. But in an in-between spot, like going down a little private street or in your backyard or someplace that's not walled off, right? They call that a karmelit. That's something only the rabbis had prohibited. The rabbis said you can carry there. Right? And for that reason, there's an argument you shouldn't tear on Shabbat. You shouldn't tear paper on Shabbat into certain shapes, right? But for the sake of human dignity, since it's not really a biblical prohibition, it's a rabbinic one, we allowed people to use toilet paper and to tear it because this is like our version of the smooth stones, all right? It goes on from there. There are many rules that we don't really have in Judaism anymore. I know you think that Judaism has a lot of rules, but let me tell you, nothing compared to the ancient times. So in ancient times, if anybody here a Kohen or a Levi, women, men from a Kohen Levi family, anyone? None? All right, good. Real commoners you guys are. So am I, but So if you're a Kohen, let's say, you're not allowed to go into a cemetery in Judaism. Fine. But what's a cemetery? In Jacksonville, you've probably got a place, it's a field, it's got a fence around it, it's got a gate, and it says something cemetery. Right? That we know where the bodies are buried. Right? But in ancient times, and even today, in many places, bodies were just buried. People were buried wherever they were buried. The backyard was fine. Under a tree was fine. There were a lot of places. And so the problem is that in Judaism, if you walk on top of a grave, you become impure. And if you're a Kohen, that's a prohibition. But not only a Kohen. If you're a Nazirite, which we read about in Nassau on Shabbat, you also can't become impure. Not only that, any Jew who wants to go to the temple and bring a sacrifice, like say for Passover, the Paschal lamb, can't become impure. Not only that, but if you are a farmer and you have to bring tithes to the Kohen and to the priest, right, those have to be kept pure too, right? Any of these things, if you were to carry that produce through a field where a body was buried, right, then that would have to be burned, and that might be like a big part of your income for the year. So the rabbi said, well, that's only true in a real cemetery, but there's some fields where we don't know. It's a field that's been plowed. There's a rumor that once somebody was buried in that field, but we don't know if the bones are there anymore. The field has been plowed. We don't know. Is it a good thing to walk through that field if you're a priest? No, it isn't. You should avoid it if you can. But what if you can't? What if, for instance, you were walking on a mission through that field? You were accompanying a mourner on their way home from the burial to their home, and the mourner chose to walk through that field. Right? Are you allowed, if you're a Kohen, to say to the mourner, hey, I'll catch up with you later, and leave them walking home alone from the burial? No, because that would be against their dignity. So to protect the dignity of your friend, the Kohen can violate a law. Now, I may have lost you all, right? But just stick with me for one more minute, because we're now going to get to our time, right? What we've learned so far is that for human dignity's sake, right, to save a life, you can violate a biblical law because you're protecting the divine image in a person. To save human dignity, right, which is also connected to us being made in the image of God, right, you are also allowed to violate a law, but not a biblical law. Because if you did a biblical law, it'd be like saying, my dignity is more important than God's. Right? But you are allowed to violate a rabbinic law. So, many years ago, I was a rabbinical student from 89 to 94, my years in rabbinical school. And during that time, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which I'm on, Rabbi Lubliner has been on, had its first debate about basically gay rights. Right? And basically there were some people who said, the Bible says a man should not lie with another man. Right? It's an abomination. They should be put to death. Boom. it's forbidden in the Torah. The other people said, but people's sexuality is part of their identity. It's not something you just turn on and turn off. And it's cruel to tell gay people that they cannot find a way, that they cannot have a partner in life. Isn't it said in the Torah, it's not good for a person to be alone, lo tov heyot adam levado, right? Doesn't Adam say, I'm lonely, can I have a partner? And God says, sure, I'll make you a helpmate. So how can it be that a whole class of people are told, no matter what in life, you'll always be alone? Many people are alone anyway, fine, but categorically, don't even try. You'll never be together with another person, right? And if you are, it's an abomination, right? That itself is a violation of human dignity, it would seem, right? But no one made that argument at the time. Only many years later, when I was now a rabbi in Michigan and a member of the law committee, I was studying this passage in the Talmud in Tractate Brachot, page 19, and there's this description, so great is human dignity that it overrides a negative principle in the Torah. And I thought to myself, and by then I had many gay friends, right? And some members of the family as well. And I was truly distraught about it. I remember the first time I tried to write something, thanks, Kim. The first time I tried to write something about gay rights, I said, on the one hand, the Torah says it's prohibited. On the other hand, there are these wonderful people and we should be able to do something. But what can we do? The Torah says, no, I guess we can't do anything. And I remember my wife, Lynn, said to me at the time, if that's the best you got, it's not good enough. Don't even speak. And she was right. And so years later, I thought, well, maybe human dignity can be like the key that opens this lock. And I joined together with two other rabbis, Rabbi Elliot Dorff and Rabbi Avram Reisner, and we wrote a tshuva for the law committee that said, just look at the notes there in the chat. We wrote an argument that said, the truth is that the prohibitions on same-sex intimacy in Judaism are mostly not biblical. The Bible says nothing about sexual intimacy between women, for example, right? So if you're to say that lesbian sex is forbidden in Judaism, I dare you to find a verse that would support that, even a far-fetched reading of the verse. There isn't any. Right? And even with two men, while the Bible clearly has these two verses in the book of Leviticus in chapter 18 and chapter 20, it's not clear what it's talking about exactly. It seems, and it's understood by the rabbis, to mean actual intercourse between two men, anal intercourse. And so the rabbis did say that any intimacy between two men or between two women was forbidden, but we argued that's only according to rabbinic authority. And as you now know, when it's a case of rabbinic authority versus human dignity, the rabbis said, we relinquish our own authority in order to allow other people to live with dignity. And in case you think that the embarrassment experienced by gay people before very recent times is a small matter, notice that Judaism prohibits humiliating another person and considers it a tort, like a penalty-bearing offense. Right? So if I were to say to somebody, you're ugly, or I don't like your shoes, or something like that, and I did it in a way that was humiliating to them in public, they could claim damages in Judaism, right? And so when we had completely heterosexual, heteronormative communities where a lot of Jewish communities would say, oh, we're welcoming, we're inclusive, there are just no gay people here. You had to ask yourself, well, why are there no gay people here? Are you saying there are no gay Jews? I remember when that horrible head of Iran, Ahmadinejad, came to New York, and he spoke Chair, I think you were there back then. He came to Columbia University and spoke on the campus, and somebody asked him about gay rights in Iran, and he said, "Oh, we don't have any homosexuals in Iran," and so that was his answer. So many people felt that, like, if you don't see anybody, you don't know anybody, then they aren't there. But of course, we all know the reason why gay people were not seen was because it was dangerous for them to be seen. If they were to sort of reveal their identity, they could be beaten, they could be fired, they could be separated from their family. If they were married, they could lose their children. I mean, there were all sorts of horrible things that would happen. And even absent such dire consequences, if you were to go to synagogue, and can you mute? Good, thanks. If you were to go to synagogue and see a couple like my wife and I, it was our Hebrew anniversary, 31st anniversary this weekend, and imagine we had an aliyah in synagogue. That's very nice. People are celebrating Danny and Lynn. But if you were a gay person in the congregation, you might think, when do I get to be celebrated? When do I get to have my relationship recognized? Will I ever? And not only is this painful, but it also was so hard that many gay people were committing suicide, and still are. So we argued that as a result, our obligation to protect human dignity required us to suspend at least the rabbinic level prohibitions. And we tried to say almost everything is rabbinic level. We did, however, have to say, by the logic of our own paper, that one act, which is actual intercourse between two men, does seem to be biblically prohibited, and therefore it remains forbidden even with our claims for human dignity. And some people don't like that argument. I don't particularly like that argument, but we saw no way to avoid that argument. And I'll point out, and I'm probably going to lose you all right now, but it's actually no different from what the Bible says about a heterosexual couple, which is not allowed to have sex when the woman is menstruating. That's also the same level of prohibition. And not only when she's menstruating, but until she is after her period, which can be a good part of the month, right? So we said there are biblical prohibitions that affect a straight couple or a gay couple, and even a lesbian couple. Maybe we would say that they shouldn't be intimate when either of them is menstruating. But this becomes part of their private life, right? They can be recognized as a couple, they can be married. If they want to take on leadership roles in the congregation, president of the shul, or just leading davening, or if they want to become a rabbi or a cantor, there should be no prohibition on their full participation because their human dignity serves as a general permission for any rabbinic level prohibitions. And the other business that's biblical, right, is their private matter. And that's something that they can talk about among themselves in their own private space, just like a straight couple might talk about how are we going to deal with menstruation and our sex life, right? And that's no one else's business other than that couple. Of course, they want to go to their doctor, they want to go to their rabbi, they want to talk about it, that's fine, right? But it's their private business that nobody else gets to ask about. So I've just spoken for quite some time, actually almost an hour. So I'm going to stop here and first of all, see if there are any questions about any of the things I've said. To review, we have a theological idea that while God has no specific form, God does have a general form in the sense of being embedded in all of humanity, that this theological idea yields a moral idea, right, which is that we have to respect each other's image, right? It also leads to some practical consequences like saving a life and even protecting the dignity of other people, and that this can then be applied to solve difficult dilemmas like how do we make room for people who until now, or until very recently, had been excluded from our communities so that they can feel at one. So I'm curious if anybody on this call has any opinions, has any experiences, whether among friends and family, has any objections or concerns, bring it on. Carl, you're up.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you very much for your talk. I think part of the reason we see a male image of God is, number one, I think when God presents God's self to people, he presents them in a way that they can relate to, so that they can associate with it. And I think if it shows up as something totally different, that puts a whole nother level of understanding that they have to go through. They have to process that, as well as the message that the Almighty is passing on to us. And I also think we perpetuate it by, if you look at the English translations, everything refers to God as He or
Correct.
Lord. And degenderizing that would help tremendously. And I think people could begin to understand that. But I just think the reason that God appears as, also look at who's saying it, look like a man. Men are saying it.
Correct.
We don't know. Maybe if Miriam had seen God, she would say it looked like a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to look at it in that context. But I also think that we perpetuate it by continually talking about Lord and He in the English translation of our prayers.
So I agree with both points, Carl, and I thank you for that contribution. I personally try to avoid gendered language for God, and unless I'm specifically translating something to understand what it literally means, I try to degender the language and speak of God as they or just as God. The word God doesn't feel like it has a gendered valence as much as the word Lord does. Some people prefer the word sovereign because that's not gendered. Queen Elizabeth is the sovereign of England, of the United Kingdom, for example. But we Americans don't especially like royal imagery altogether. So sometimes we just refer to God as Hashem, right? It's the name, right? And as you know, the name for God, Yud He Vav He, refers to sort of being, right? Which is also not gendered. Now, it's interesting, a couple of things, other ideas. One is when the Ten Commandments begins, Anochi Adonai Elohechem, I'm the Lord your God. Your is plural, all of you. I'm Rochel's God, I'm Carl's God, I'm Lois's God, I'm Sandra's God, I'm Marco's God, I'm Cindy's God, and so on. Barbara's God. Although that's not Barbara, I'm guessing, but I'm not positive. So there she is. Okay. So and the Midrash says in Midrash Sikta Derav Kahana that each person imagined God in terms that worked for them, right? So young people saw God as young, older people saw God as old, strong people saw God as mighty, weaker people saw God as gentle, and so on, and also with gender. So that's one piece that we are clearly projecting, right, based on our own experience and based on our own image of God embedded within each of us.
Well, isn't that similar to what I think it's a Midrash? Everybody got manna in the desert,
right?
But
and
some people had milk and some people had fleischdick on the same meal. And again, it was what met their needs, what their perception was.
Correct. Of course, I think we do want to have some sense that we have a collective identification of God with certain qualities, and that it's not entirely idiosyncratic, but that there are certain things that we speak of about God as a God of compassion, for example, right? And a God of truth and a God of love, and so on. So we want to ascribe certain qualities to God that are not just, my opinion, but even there, how it plays out can vary. Now, I'll add, Judaism is an old religion, and it has a very rich literature. And in the Middle Ages, there took shape an idea of the divine realm as having these different qualities, sort of 10 names for God, and the 22 letters, the 10 numbers, And some of these sort of qualities of God came to be known as the Sfirot. And here I'm talking about Jewish mysticism, about the Kabbalah. Right? Thank you, Lenny. I'll come back to you. Good. So about the Sfirot, though, that some of those were given a masculine valence, and some a feminine valence. Right. So there's a quality of God called Bina, wisdom, which is considered the maternal realm, the upper mother, and then Shekhinah, the divine presence, is considered the lower mother. So these are two big female powers in this structure. There are others that are male, others that are not gendered. And so there's sort of a balance that happens between male influence and female influence, even within God. Okay? And it's actually a kind of nice way to think about us. I mean, I identify as a man, in today's language, cisgender male, right? But, I've got a female side to me, and a side to me that perhaps was shaped more by my mother of blessed memory. Truth is that I think my father's probably got some of the qualities you think of as more maternal, and my mother had some of the paternal types of qualities. And I wonder if we went around and asked about the stereotype of what a man is like and what a woman is like, how many of us could say, well, it actually played out a little differently. It plays out a little differently in my family. There are people playing roles. But this idea that we have within us, multiple gender modalities. I'm not saying that I'm non-binary or anything like that. I'm not. I'm very male. But I can sort of see that there's a female side to life which resonates with me at times. And I think that being able to sort of see that, and so, Carl, actually, some people say you shouldn't avoid gendered language. You should alternate gendered language. Right? So speak of God as she sometimes and as he sometimes. And that way you're sort of lifting up instead of stripping away. Right? The Jewish Publication Society does have a gender neutral or gender sensitive, I think they call it, translation of the Bible that tries to diminish the role of gender. Now, Lenny wrote in the chat, how do you degenderize a phrase like Hu Elokeinu, Hu Avinu, right? He is our God, he is our Father, right? Well, you could say, the Lord is our God, the Lord is our parent. You could say, instead of he, you could say you. That's what some people do. You are our God, you are our parent, and use the non-gendered language for Avinu, because after all, Avotenu means our ancestors, not just our fathers. Right? And we've gotten good in English at moving. But Lenny, you've got a point there. Hebrew, like a lot of Romance languages and many languages, assigns gender to most nouns, for example. And it's very hard to degenderize Hebrew in general. Okay? So there are some linguists who have tried to come up with a way of degendering or gender neutraling Hebrew. So let's say men eat, hem ochlim, yud mem at the end. Women eat, hen ochlot. So how would you say a group, normally a group that's mixed like this group, we just use the male language as the default. Hem ochlim, all of them, guys and girls, they all eat, right? But use the masculine language. Well, but what if there are non-binary people there, right? So one proposal is to double up the suffix and say ochlimiot, and have both the masculine and the plural endings. Not many people think that this is an attractive solution, but it's a creative solution. And who knows, I think the language will become less gendered in the years ahead. And as you know, Spanish also, they've got this problem. They've got Latina and Latino, and so they've tried to come up with Latinx, for sort of a neutral term that's referring to people from Spanish, South American ancestry who are male, female, or neither, or both. And it's hard. It's hard. And it's also not in Spanish. Yeah, Wendy, go ahead. Let's hear you.
But Hebrew is a very old language. And we have biblical Hebrew, so it's at least 2,000, 3,000, 2,500 years old.
Correct.
Right? So you can't tell me that this problem just suddenly appeared, because in the Talmud, they spent many, many hundreds of years discussing almost everything. So this, I've never seen it discussed in the Talmud, but surely somebody had raised this issue before. Do you
You're
think
right.
it was edited out at one point?
Well, you know, the current language of trying to decenter masculine experience and say that we won't by default treat like people as male and females as a subset of humans, that's a fairly modern project. I'll give you two responses, Wendy. There's a scholar at GTS who Rabbi Rosenblum studied with, named Amy Kalmanovsky. She's a professor of Bible, right? And she's got a recent book called Gender Play in the Hebrew Bible, which examines many, many stories, more than you'd expect, where women seem to be taking on masculine roles and men seem to be taking on feminine roles. Just to take some familiar stories. Rebecca is a much more active and bold character than her husband Isaac. Isaac seems to stay at home with his mom a lot. Right? He seems very domestic in his interests, whereas Rebecca travels from Mesopotamia to the land. She goes out and demands things of God. She arranges their family's succession plan. She rearranges things that her husband has tried to put in place. Right? So that's an example of a female character sort of playing a masculine role. Undermining the patriarchy would be the feminist expression of that. Right? There are many other stories like that. But Dr. Kalmanovsky says that, in fact, the Bible isn't advancing a feminist agenda here. It's actually creating tension, which gets resolved when gender roles return to the norm. So sometimes you tell a story, this is what happens, children, when you play with fire, right? There was a little boy, there was a little girl, they were told not to play with fire, they did, it was beautiful, they were having a good time, and then it got out of control and burned their house down, right? You tell a story that sort of shows that it might even be fun for a while to reverse norms, but it's going to have a negative consequence. And so she thinks that these gender play stories are actually designed to sort of reinforce the patriarchy instead of undermine it. But they still are interesting from a perspective. I'm going to give you one example from this past week's Torah portion. Yes, all right, Lenny, we'll come back to that. But because Wendy asked whether there's anything in the text, there was a little passage just before the passage of the Sota this past week in Nassau. It says, Ish o Isha, a man or a woman who wrongs their fellow person. Right? L'chol nefesh, any person. It used the word nefesh. Right? Now it's already introduced the word ish, man, and the word isha, woman. And then it adds the word nefesh, a soul. The rabbi said, what was that? What was the need for yet another identity? And they said it was to include tumtum and androgynous. Tumtum and androgynous are Greek loanwords that the rabbis use to describe people who are intersex, right? Who have sort of indeterminate gender. A tumtum, you can't see either masculine or feminine sexual characteristics. The androgynous, you see both, right? You see the sexual characteristics of both on that body, right? So they said, so you're not allowed to harm a woman, you're not allowed to harm a man, you're also not allowed to harm an intersex person. This is a rabbinic interpretation of a biblical text. Does the biblical text really mean that? I don't think so. But the rabbis felt the need to expand gender beyond the binary that we are accustomed to. And so that becomes an interesting and useful text as we try to understand gender as it's presented in our time.
Are you saying that that rabbinic text is ancient rabbinic text?
Yes, yeah, it's called
that they were referring to someone whose gender was indeterminate?
Yes, yeah, and we have several of those. These are ancient texts. They're about 1,800-year-old texts. They're from the Tannaitic period, which is like a few generations after the temple was destroyed. So say around 200, 250 CE. Right? And several texts talk about a tumtum and androgynous. They may have been genetic disorders, where people are YYX and things like that. Some of you probably know more about this than I do, but there are many different gender variations, right? Or genetic variations, which lead to unusual morphology, body shape. There are people whose bodies differ from other people in a variety of ways. Maybe they're disabilities, but in this case, the ancient world knew of people who are born with an intersex type of gender. And the rabbis debate it a lot. Are they obligated to do things like the pilgrimage festival? Only males were obligated to go on the pilgrimage festival. Well, what about an androgynous who has a penis but also a vagina? Right? Do they have to go on the pilgrimage festival? And so they discussed this. Was it common? I don't know if it was common, but they knew of this, Aaron. And it's not necessarily the same thing that a trans person today or a non-binary person today experiences, but it does show that there was more room on the continuum of gender than just the simple binary that we've got. This is a male, this is a female. Now Lenny, it's a good question. If you made the argument that being gay is genetically determined would have made the job of the law committee easier, probably yes. And in fact, Rabbi Joel Roth, who is my teacher and is more traditional than we were in his view, he back in 91 maybe, had written a paper called Homosexuality, in which he tried to study what was known in the early 1990s or the late 80s about what was called the etiology of homosexuality. The word etiology, like the origin of a disease, was already a judgmental word, right? And he argued, well, we don't really know. Is there a gay gene? Is it more of a nurture thing than a nature thing? What's going on? Of course, we don't know why people are heterosexual either, right? So he argued that even if we did have genetic proof that someone had to be gay, it still wouldn't justify changing the law. The Bible says what the Bible says, and such people can live a celibate life. It's a very hard thing to ask of them. Straight people should realize how much is being done to gay people and be compassionate. That was kind of his approach. Our approach was, it's actually quite difficult to understand how sexuality takes shape in people. Clearly there is some sort of genetic involvement, but certainly there's some environmental involvement. And so what we argued was it's less relevant, or at least it's less helpful to focus on genetics, since we don't really, most characteristics that people have come from multiple genes and their interaction with the environment, what we call epigenetics, right? Which is that some gene expression happens in certain environments and not in other environments. So it's too complicated. The question was, can somebody who's gay suddenly say, oh, I know I'm gay, I'm only attracted to people of the same sex, but I'm going to choose to be straight, right? Because I want live according to some ideal, whether it's my parents' ideal or the Torah's ideal. And what we noticed was that people who tried such using therapy, what was called conversive therapy or reparative therapy, were having horrible experiences. They were being asked to sort of hurt themselves a bit, like they would have a rubber band, and whenever they had a gay thought, they would sort of like snap it on their wrist to try to give it a negative association. There were all sorts of, both in the Christian and in the Jewish world, thoughts that if you eat lots of figs or something, that would get rid of your homosexual thoughts, and so people were eating huge amounts of figs. There are all sorts of things like this. And then in the ultra-Orthodox community, gay people were being told, you still should marry somebody of the opposite sex or the opposite gender and act like things are normal, right? And if you have these other desires, try your best to suppress them. And if you can't suppress them, then, just go far away, go out of town, do what you got to do, and come home and then go back to your normal life. And this, of course, was completely undermining family relationships. It was also bringing in the dangers of, venereal disease and AIDS and things like that, because people were sort of being encouraged to sleep around, and it was undermining their dignity. And so several ultra-Orthodox therapists started to say this is not moral. We will not allow it. And as you know, many states made a rule saying it was forbidden to try conversive therapy. So Lenny, I'm not sure I answered your question, but it would have been easier if we had said, this is a gay gene, this is how you have to be. Not entirely, because you could still say, well, so then just don't have any sex, And what we argued was that there was a positive value to people being given a pathway to form a relationship and to be recognized in their community and to create a family as a same-sex couple. That would be a way of giving them dignity and hope. Okay, so I think Aaron, and if anyone else wants to jump in, you can put it in the chat or just raise your hand. Go ahead, Aaron.
So I wanted to go back to something you said about ritual impurity and the Kohanim having to be careful where they walk in fields and things like that. And tie that also to not having sex with a woman who is menstruating or just after. The first thing about the Kohen being ritually impure, if people were being buried randomly as opposed to in formal cemeteries,
yes,
then it would almost seem to me that no religious Kohen today who still believes in the laws of impurity can walk anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, because unless there's an expiration date on when the body is no longer considered to be a body and it just totally deteriorated, they don't know where they can walk in Israel. So they shouldn't be going anywhere. So that ties then to the second part of the question, which is, wasn't a lot of ritual impurity and not associated with going to the Beis Mikdash and sacrificing? And since we have none, for better or for worse, then why are rules such as husband and wife not being able to have relationships during a certain period of time, why are those even a question of valid laws today?
Well, because there are two different systems. The Bible describes menstrual impurity as being something that no man should approach a woman while she's menstruating. I mean, it's not only a question by approach, have sex with her. It's not linked specifically to being in the temple. The part about being in the temple is that anybody who's come in contact with death, and it's not only menstruation, men who've ejaculated also are impure, right? And need to go to the mikveh, right? Before they can go to the temple, right? Or if they're a Kohen, before they could eat truma. So if a man had sex or or had a wet dream or whatever, they would then need to wait a day and bathe in the mikveh before they'd be allowed to go into the temple, right? So these are things that are a part of ancient, ethics, which seem very foreign to a lot of us. One of the few things that we still keep is that Kohanim still try to avoid going into a building where there's a dead body, unless it's sort of segregated in some way. And we tend to wash our hands, before eating, which is a good idea in general, but it's also a way of lifting up the sanctification of eating by saying we're going to wash our hands. But you said this interesting thing earlier about the land of Israel. So first of all, in ancient times, they would try to mark graves, not just the way we do with a granite stone with people's birth date and death date and all that, and their name, but they would, even just a rock that we didn't know who was buried there, but we knew there was a body there, they would put lime on the stone, right? And they would sort of paint it. And then people who were pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem would know to walk around that grave. And in fact, one of the rules right before Purim, right, the month of Adar, was that after the winter rains had washed away a lot of that lime, people would go and they would identify the stones where they knew that there used to be lime, and they would reapply it, and that was a way of preparing for the spring festival season of Passover and Shavuot and Sukkot, because it's dry in the summer in the Middle East. And so you would get 3 months, 3 holidays of use out of that. So, of course, there was a long period of time when Jews were not living in most parts of the land of Israel. There might have been a small Jewish community in Galilee, that kind of thing, but not in Jerusalem. And so isn't it the case that we've sort of lost track of where no one knows where the bodies are buried, right? And you ask, is there an expiration date on bodies? There may be an expiration date in that if there's no longer even a small, like a tiny little bone that could be identified. But the Jewish mysticism says that there's one bone that never decays. It's going to be the basis of our resurrection at the end of time. So if you believe that, then you're right. There's bodies everywhere. So I think a Kohen might just say, I'm only responsible for what I can plausibly know. Right? I'm not an angel. So if I know there's a body here, I won't go there. Okay? And I'm going to go beyond just avoiding cemeteries. I'm actually going to do some due diligence. Does anybody know if that field's okay, that road's okay? And by the way, as you know, in Israel, whenever they're doing building, they have to get all these extra permits to look for bones. And if they find human bones, they move them so that you don't build the building over the bones. And it's not just like a respect thing, it's also a purity thing. So a Kohen family can move into that building. So there are efforts made, but I think you're right. And the last thing I'll say about this part is that we're all impure, I'm sorry to say. But if you had any thought that you are in a state of ritual purity, it's not possible really to be a human, because we've all been in contact with the dead in some way, either directly or indirectly, right? I certainly, I don't do a lot, but I do taharas several times a year, right? So I'm in a state of ritual impurity. And if the temple were rebuilt tomorrow, I could go to the mikveh all I want. It wouldn't suffice. The mikveh doesn't purify you from corpse contamination. What do you need? You need the red heifer, right? It's from chapter 19 of Numbers. And we don't have a red heifer, right? So, there's this whole cart before the horse or chicken and egg problem. You can't have a temple until you have a priest who's pure. You can't have a priest who's pure unless you've got the red heifer. And you can't have the red heifer ritual unless you have the temple. So you got yourself stuck in a little circle there. There's some theories, you could have a woman give birth to a Kohen on a little bubble or something, like a boy in the bubble type of thing, to keep this Kohen pure until they grow up, and then they can sacrifice them. You see, we've got a problem here. It's why, for me, to be honest, this is an interesting part of our history. It's part of the sort of culture, but it's not a practical part of my religious identity, and I'm not especially eager for the temple to be rebuilt. All right, is there one more question? Because we're sort of out of time, but we started a minute or two late. Is there anybody else who hasn't spoken who would like to? Aaron, you seem to have something else. Oh, and Wendy too. You guys can both say your thing quickly, and then we're going to just finish up. Go ahead, Wendy.
I
Please.
just wanted to thank you for your plug for Chava Kadisha. We're looking for new members.
Very good. I'm glad to hear it. And go ahead, Aaron.
So I was going to say that it sounds like a good business to go into is mikvahs in Brooklyn.
Oops.
Because they need them. And the second thing is, there is an answer to your question about the chicken and egg, by the way.
Oh yeah? What is it?
Well, God didn't create eggs, he created chickens. So we know the answer.
Chicken first. There you go.
Or it's created. I shouldn't have said he, sorry.
Indeed. All right. So guys, and women, see there, I was gendered. Look, it's something we all have to work on. And I think it's not just a cute thing. It's actually part of creating a more holy and inclusive community. Anyway, so it's been a pleasure. Tomorrow night, I must admit, I'm dreading the subject, but it's the future of conservative Judaism. And so the reason I'm dreading it is I love being a conservative Jew. I think this is a wonderful way of practicing Judaism in the world. And I'm not as disconsolate as some people are. I just had a very good day. I just ordained 5 new cantors and 15 new rabbis. They all have jobs. They're going out. They're going to do beautiful work in the world. I'm very bullish. But I also realize things change. And, the Judaism of 50 years from now will be different from the Judaism of today. It may or may not have the same labels that we use today. And in a way, I'm more concerned about the substance of it. Are people learning Torah? Are they doing mitzvot? Are they doing them in a compassionate and inclusive way? Are they engaged citizens in the world around them? Are they improving society? If they're doing all those things and they call themselves something other than conservative Jew, I won't be, feel like a failure. But anyway, so come tomorrow night. We'll look at the Pew study, which just came out, and you can feel free to look at that too and sort of see what the numbers are telling us. And we'll discuss it. And I'm going to expect you guys to be participants. Okay? Okay. So I see
Lenny says thank you. And I know everyone else, myself included, says thank you so much for the conversation tonight. I know it was more lecture than conversation, but I think that everybody seemed to enjoy, and the questions that were able to be asked were insightful ones, and we'll look forward to learning more tomorrow at the conclusion of our 3-part series.
Beautiful.
So, Mazel tov to all your new rabbis and cantors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Mazel tov, everybody.
Bye.
Like the format.
Okay, great.